We've seen what happens when you start a great witch hunt in Europe, but what happens when you export it? Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. My name is Justin, and I can't believe we're here, but we're on Chapter 5 of Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch. This is just such a pleasure to be here and to be able to do this book, and so to finish this book out, Chapter 5 is of course the final chapter in Caliban and the Witch. It's kind of bittersweet, right? We're at the end of this road. This is honestly one of my favorite books that I've done so far on this channel, and we've done some absolute bangers, but I think it's because I read this book many years ago now, and so to be able to revisit it, especially after having done things like Bookchin's The Ecology of Freedom and Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America, is such an absolute pleasure because you get to see sort of the sharpness and the keenness of Federici's argument and the way that it interacts with these other books, and it's been so cool to be able to go through this book and write these scripts and come here and do these videos and to see some of the reactions that people have with Caliban and the Witch has been such an absolute pleasure. So I'm not ready to close out yet, but yet we must. If you are on the Patreon channel, if you're a Patreon subscriber, you will see one final video, and that's going to wrap all of this together, give us some big takeaways, give you my kind of personal thoughts on Federici if you haven't had enough of that, and it's going to give you kind of a what you need to know from this book if you haven't read it as well. So that's all there up on the Patreon. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. Thank you so much to anybody who is already a subscriber over on the Patreon. It's so important to me to be able to offer this main feed series to people for free, and so your support there, it helps me keep doing this, and it really means the world. So thank you so much. Please, as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, tell your friends, all of that good stuff. And you can check this out on multiple platforms as well. You can check out the YouTube, the Patreon, it's up on Spotify, all that good stuff. So without further ado, let's do the roadmap here. There are not that many pages in this chapter, but there's so much packed in here, and it's one of my criticisms of this chapter in particular is that I wish there was more. Because when you start to talk about witchcraft in the context of colonization, they are inextricably intertwined, and Federici makes that point very clearly in this chapter, but I just wish there was more. Federici does so much work in the first 4 chapters of this book to tell us about what's going on in Europe and to give us so much historical background, and so to come to the Americas and to see how the great witch hunt in Europe interacts with this process of colonization. I think to try to pack all of that into 30 pages is ambitious to say the least. But the way I'm breaking down this chapter is in 5 sections. We're going to talk about the one big objection that you could make to Federici and all of her work. I haven't been terribly critical of Federici throughout this entire process, and it's because I agree with basically everything she says, but there is one big objection that you could make, and we'll talk about that. We kind of have to. The second thing we're going to tackle is colonization and witch hunting, so general overview. And then we're going to talk about witchcraft as a justification for conquest. Following that, we're going to talk about resistance and repression. What does this look like as it starts to get going? And then we're going to spend some time musing at the end of this on power and the legacy of the witch in a colonial context. And again, there will be one final video on the Patreon to kind of sum all this together and just pull it all into one place. Now, without further ado, let's start with the kind of one big objection. This is one main issue that runs through all of Federici's kind of incredible work that she's done in this book. And it's kind of a necessary issue because we are trying to fit hundreds of years and multiple countries, right? If you count around the world, it's kind of dozens of countries where various forms of witch trials happen, and we're trying to fit them into one solid narrative that we can talk about, right? We can analyze it from a Marxist lens and talk about it properly. But that is something that you you can't actually do. The narrative that Federici is trying to impose across all of this history that happens, and again, across hundreds of years, across multiple countries, is that witchcraft was used as a means to subjugate the bodies of women at the whims of capitalism, right? It's all at the behest of this nascent capitalism as it's developing. That is a really, really good story. However, when you try to combine all of this together into one totalizing story, you lose a lot of necessary detail. And so there are critics who will come out, and I recommend, if you get a chance, checking out Richard Keeker's really interesting Mythologies of Witchcraft in the 15th Century. That's from 2006. It's freely available through Project Muse. But critics like him, it's not exactly a criticism, but they point out that witchcraft is understood in different ways by different people, necessarily. And this is a criticism that has kind of been bubbling under the surface the entire time, but it comes out particularly in this chapter. Silvia Federici is relying a lot in this chapter on analysis by Irene Silverblatt, who has a fantastic analysis here. And it makes a lot of sense, but what Silverblatt is really describing is a series of witch hunts throughout Peru especially, but the Andean region in particular. And is it correct that we call this kind of a one totalizing witch hunt? Is this an effort? Is this a meaningful push, or are these isolated incidents? It's really kind of up to interpretation. Now, this, of course, is something that Federici is very aware of, and she got to it actually in the last chapter as well, when she starts talking about the differences between the conception of the witch as the kind of old crone out for vengeance and the young, rebellious, beautiful spirit, right? These are two vastly different conceptions of what a witch is, and the chasm between them is very, very meaningful. But obviously, as I've said before, I agree with pretty much everything Federici says in this book. I don't think this does really anything terribly harmful to her overall analysis, which is witchcraft in all of its various forms is mostly a means to control the bodies of women, to subjugate women on behalf of the elite, the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, whatever you want to call it. Now, what this really says to me, this one big objection as I framed it, is that there's more work required, right? We need to understand the various intersections of witchcraft, how it was understood in various contexts, and how it was used to subjugate the bodies of women, because that is really mostly what it's being used for. It's mostly why it's popping up. There will be necessarily differences in this approach, and there may be ways that we have talked about witchcraft, and will talk about witchcraft, especially in this video, where it might not be appropriate to call this a push against witchcraft or a witchcraft in any real meaningful sense, but we will only learn that with further analysis and further work. And so that's why that is so important, and I think Federici is laying a foundation here for everything that comes after her. But just as we go in to talk about this, bear in mind that we have confined ourselves to Europe, and there's a lot that can be said about Europe, but once you start departing from Europe, once you start going into Latin America in the context of colonization, there are narratives here that become even grander, and it becomes a little more difficult to take them as coherent narratives just because they're trying to encompass so much of what's going on. But let's now get into the chapter properly. Now, Federici in this chapter is really, her main thrust of this chapter is to connect the Great Witch Hunt and the violence that happened there with the violence that happens in the colonial context. And all of this takes place roughly around the same time, right? We're talking 1500s, 1600s, what you might call the Age of Discovery, right? As Europe is coming into the New World, another phrase that I really, really hate, but as Europe is coming into the New World, because Federici uses this phrase, I'm just going to kind of copy her here, they start to export a lot of the violence. And there's a lot to be said about that very fact. When I was talking about the work of Galeano, for example, I think two books ago, The Open Veins of Latin America, one of the things that I said is that it's very important to study these kind of colonial contexts because that's what gets imported. So even if you live in the United States or the United Kingdom or one of these highly developed countries that used to be an empire, or in the context of the US, still very much is an empire, you start to see the colonial strategies that have been previously on foreign shores start to be imported. This is something that happens, for example, in Ireland. Patrick Radden Keefe makes this argument in his book Say Nothing, which is you look at the strategies, the violence that was used against the IRA in Ireland that was trying to resist British occupation of Northern Ireland, and you see the exact same strategies, and in some cases the same people who were using those strategies be imported from places like Kenya or Malaya. So what Federici is telling us here is the things that Europeans were doing to the witches of Europe were the same things that they were doing to the indigenous people of the Americas. There's a clear line of continuity here. You get land dispossession, you get forced Christianization, you get the destruction of the communal and autonomous structures. All of this is happening concurrently in both places. And witch hunting, which was a technique of terror in Europe, becomes just the same thing in a colonial context, a new technique of terror to control. And this is very important because, of course, there's a huge difference between what's happening with the witch trials in Europe and what's happening with the enslavement and genocide of the indigenous peoples in Latin America and the Americas at large. However, there are points of connection and continuity. One of the big things that's important to highlight here, however, and we'll get a little bit into this later on, is in Europe, there was already an understanding of witchcraft. In Latin America and the Americas in general, there was no such clear understanding of witchcraft. And again, it really depends which part of the continents you're talking about here. But in general, this kind of European, very Christian conception of witchcraft as it existed in Europe, of course, that had to be changed and adapted to suppress women and the power of magic. We've talked about this before. That all had to be changed in a European context, but it was completely new in the Americas. But all of this is ultimately for the purpose of control. And this takes us to the third part of this video, where I wanted to talk about justifying conquest. This is also something that we have seen before a lot, especially we've talked about multiple books about the decolonial period, right? We talked about The Wretched of the Earth, the incredible Frantz Fanon book. We talked about Eduardo Galeano's Hope and Veins of Latin America. And in both cases, you come to this understanding of the European Empire trying to define indigenous people as subhuman. Their colonial conquest, they want to create a notion in the European mind of something that is savage, right? We've talked before about the civilizing mission. That's where all of this comes from. And Federici is putting her finger exactly on this point, and she wants to get to it through the lens of cannibalism. I should say cannibalism and devil worship, witchcraft in general, but cannibalism is really one of the big things that comes to the front. This isn't exactly a natural thing either. It's kind of a black hole in the European mind at this point for what is exactly on these savage shores. You get in the beginning this kind of imagery of the innocent and generous native inhabitant of these lands who gives whatever is needed. But then you also have another narrative being pushed at the time of savagery, of cannibalism. Remember, Columbus is arriving. Federici says he arrives before the witch trials start. I would a little bit push that timeline back into the 1400s. I think there's been some interesting recent research that says the witch trials really kick off kind of the mid to late 1400s really is where we start having evidence for this kind of systematic oppression of women through witch trials. However, either way, Columbus comes from a perspective of persecution, what Federici calls a persecuting society. He arrives, he sails off in 1492, and he arrives in the Isle of Hispaniola, and then you start to see this narrative being pushed. It's being pushed in mass media, as it was back then. It's being pushed by artistic depictions of the New World as well, which spread like wildfire through Europe, as you would expect them to. And the images that are being shown are cannibalism, devil worship, savagery in all of its forms. This is something that was used to frame the European mindset to justify colonization. And this kind of ideological work that's being done in the New World, of course, parallels the ideological work that's being done by the rationalism and the mechanism, which is what Federici calls it, in Europe at the time to define witches as savage and subhuman and therefore in need of oppression as well. That all brings us to resistance and repression. And I keep almost banging this mic, but that's just because I'm excited about this chapter. But let's talk a little bit about the mechanics. How exactly did this all happen? You have the encomienda system, which is very early on introduced in Latin America, and we've talked about this before. It's essentially a feudal fiefdom, right? You have workers working the lands of the lord. It's a plantation system because, as we've learned in this book and in our past book as well, The Ecology of Freedom, the feudal system had a lot more leeway for serfs to do their own thing. The encomienda system is essentially a form of slavery. But with this encomienda system comes a rising resistance because it's an incredibly brutal system, right? It's squeezing, extracting as much as possible from the workers on these plantations who are dying in these conditions. And so you see a rising resistance, and because of that rising resistance, you need control. And the control comes in the form of accusations of witchcraft. Federici, for example, talks about a 1572 Diego de Landa campaign in the Yucatan Peninsula, and that is 4,500 people are tortured and killed for idolatry. Idolatry is the worship of idols, of course. You also get at the same time, especially throughout the Andes, the destruction of the Huacas. This is a very kind of broad category that Federici is applying to various sort of animistic ideas of mountains and rivers and items and things that spirits inhabit, right? The gods or the ancestors of us who control the world around us, who have this kind of spiritual or magical power. These things are repositories of that power or those spirits. So they must be abandoned, or in some cases they must be literally destroyed. But this was a process that had to carry on as well. Federici points out that indigenous practices still existed under cover of Christianity. So ostensibly you'd be going and praying in a church, but really you would still be kind of accepting and passing down the same gods and ancestors that you used to respect. All of the same traditions are still very much alive, just Christianized a little bit, enough to get you by with the Spanish colonizer that is in your land. So you get the arrival of European-style witch hunts. This happens in the early 1600s. And 1619 to 1660 especially is kind of this hot period. You get the use of torture and forced confessions. You get all of these different parallels with the European model. It's essentially exported into a colonial context, and it's quite effective. Federici especially talks about a campaign in 1660 against the Huarochiri, an indigenous group that had retained a lot of their traditional elements and spirituality and continued to worship the Huacas despite this crackdown, and so they had to be dealt with, and they were dealt with under the guise of witchcraft. And this is where we should jump to the final section, power and the legacy of the witch. Because remember, I said all of this is new to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. It's kind of imposed, it's kind of seeded into the ideas and the mindsets of the population, and it really takes hold. And that's a problem. Or it's a problem and possibly an opportunity. The thing that we have to understand here is something that Federici has been pointing out through this entire book, and that is that most of the victims of this witch hunt and the crackdown on traditional magical practices were women. And there's a very good reason for that in the Latin American context. And specifically when she talks about things like the campaign against the Huarochiri, most of the victims here are women. And it is because women are seen as the defenders of the older way of life. There are various parts of the indigenous Americas where you have tremendous power that is vested in the hands of women. And the Spanish patriarchal invasion is there to get rid of that power. We see in this a little bit of the natural result of the divide and conquer tactics that are used by Spain and by Europe, back in Europe and in the colonies and wherever they're working, really. If you want to elevate men and lower women and destroy the power bases of women and enclose women, which is the terminology that Federici uses, you will get a natural pushback, right? Men may capitulate to the desires of the Spanish because they are the ones empowered in this scenario. They're the ones given power by the colonizer. But the women, may feel the need to protect that power and push back, and that's exactly what you see in an Indigenous context. So you see at various times women committing suicide, women killing male children. You see women rising to leadership roles against the colonization. You see even women starting to take on the language of the colonizer and using it to their own advantage. They become empowered by this new magic that's just been assigned to them, and you may rightly say, well, yes, I am this kind of high priestess of the devil. Pay attention to me. For example, Federici references a 1521 uprising in Chiapas, which is led by a high priestess. This sort of thing does happen in the Latin American context. Of course, it honestly makes me uncomfortable to be talking in such sweeping terms about such a gigantic story and to try to impose this narrative across all of that. But these are things that unquestionably happened. And one of the interesting things that Federici says at this point is, remember that central metaphor of Caliban. There is Caliban, who is the oppressed indigenous individual in the context, who resists Prospero through the language that he has learned from Prospero. So he uses Prospero's language to resist his oppressor. There's a difference between Caliban and Sycorax. Sycorax is kind of the witch in this context. Sycorax is Caliban's mother, and she was so powerful she could control the moon and the earth and the tides and the water and all of this thing about the island that Prospero has landed on. Sycorax has true power. Caliban has power through the language of his oppressor. It is still a power, but it is a much diminished power. However, it is of course a power that can be accessed by a high priestess in Chiapas. When everyone says she is a witch and she says, yes, I have access to this magical power. That is in itself a form of power, and it's really interesting to consider that. We have to kind of end this video on a modern note, and this is what Federici really wants to talk about with this chapter, which is you can look at colonization and the ways that this European anti-witch, anti-magic, anti-devilry mentality was instilled in colonial populations, and you can tie that directly to modern-day witch hunts. And modern-day witch hunts happen all the time. Federici specifically talks about Kenya, Nigeria, Cameroon, but you can go on Google right now and find from this year examples of witch hunts happening really across and around the world. And what Federici says is all of this comes from this legacy of colonization and domination and the subjugation of women. And there is no surprise that these witch hunts tend to be directed against women. In fact, most of them are. She specifically talks about Kenya and Nigeria and Cameroon because in those countries, witch hunts pop up at times of IMF-imposed structural adjustment policies. So neoliberal policies that impoverish countries at the expense of the elite. So the elite is benefiting and everyone else is suffering. And in those times of suffering, people will reach for a scapegoat. They will reach for something that gives them a little bit of power over those around them. And Federici says witch hunts happen as a result. So especially in moments of upheaval, the witch hunt becomes a weapon against women. And that is where we should leave this book. It's a brutal place to stop, but I do think that it leaves us with some necessary questions. The main question is, can we actually fit all of this into that one giant narrative? Is Federici right about what she's saying here? But the second question is, okay, fine. We know that in moments of upheaval, people reach for some type of power that they can have, something that will allow them to retain a little bit of their position. What is it that we can do about that? I don't have a good answer to that question. I'm hoping that this is something that people will talk about in the comments because I don't think that there is really any one good answer to this question. I'm sure there are many. But when we start to think about women, the subjugation of women. And again, I have said at various times that there are multiple types of intersections with what is femininity, what is gender, how do we understand this in a modern context, right? We can't necessarily just export the logic that they were using to oppress women in Europe to a modern context. These are totally different mechanisms, even though they may come from the same root. So another really important question is, how does this witch hunt mentality translate when we start to talk about, for example, the trans body, the queer body? How does this make sense in the context that Federici has given us? I think that's a really, really interesting question, and one that needs to be answered in the year 2025 when I'm recording this video. You will notice, for example, that Federici, her later work talks about this, but Caliban and the Witch doesn't necessarily address this idea of the demonization of the LGBT community. She will reference homosexuality and the ways that it was cracked down upon by the church at various points in this book, but that's pretty much where the analysis stops. So can we add to Federici's Caliban and the Witch with a modern queer theory? I think absolutely we can. And I think we must. I'm throwing out a lot of stuff to talk about here, but it's because I think Federici gives us such an important jumping off point. And it is because Federici is extending the analysis of Karl Marx. Her main criticism through this entire book has been Marx didn't think about the Great Witch Hunt at all, but this is a formative part of the primitive capital accumulation that Marx talks about, particularly in Capital Volume 3. This gives us a modern update for that, or modern at least in 2004. Where do we go from here? I think this is such an absolutely brilliant extension that Federici has given us, and where we take it from here will be very, very important. Anyway, thank you as always for watching. I feel like this was a lot more ranty than I normally get, and it's probably because this chapter leaves so much kind of open to your own interpretation and this kind of landing point of where we get to in the end of Caliban and the Witch just leaves us with so much more work to do. So let me know what you think, as always. Reach out to me directly if that's the thing that makes you feel most comfortable. People do that. Check out social media channels. I will get back to them. And obviously check out that Patreon channel, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. I will see you next week if you are on that Patreon. If not, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for going through this journey. I know Caliban and the Witch isn't the easiest book in the world to read. It's not the hardest one we've done, but it is also still ultimately an academic work. And so there's a lot of work that you have to put in to understand this book. I think it is absolutely worth it. If you've watched through these videos without reading along in the book, I really, really encourage you to just jump in. Just check out some parts of Caliban and the Witch. It is so incredibly powerful, it is so incredibly persuasive, and it will leave you with so many more questions that need answers. And that is really the best thing you can say about any work of leftist literature. So that's where we'll leave Silvia Federici and Caliban and the Witch. Thank you so much for watching. And just one quick note before I leave, I will be back not next week, that'll be on the Patreon, but on the main channel, I'll be back with our next book. And that is, of course, an absolute classic. This is Angela Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle. This we will be doing over the course of 6 weeks. Each week will be 2 chapters from this book. And the thing that I will say about Freedom is a Constant Struggle is that not only is it a seminal classic that combines a lot of ideas that Angela Davis, as this one of the greatest modern thinkers that we have in the leftist movement. A lot of her thinking is kind of condensed into this book. So it gives you a great introduction to Angela Davis, but it's also an incredibly readable and approachable book. And so if you're looking for a book in this series to jump into, something that might be a little easier, it's not going to be the ecology of freedom. You don't have to sit down and sift through these dense things. You just want a really solid discussion of modern things that are going on right now from someone who's going to give it to you without much academic nonsense around it. Check out this book. This is a perfect jumping off point for anybody who wants to get involved in leftist literature and read a little more of this stuff, but doesn't want to read, Marx's concept of primitive capital accumulation. I absolutely understand that. So check out Freedom is a Constant Struggle. That'll be up 2 weeks from now, and I will see you then. Thank you.